So welcome everyone. Sorry for a slight delay. We had some technical issues with Zoom, but now everything seems to be working. Today is our final session of the Peace Research Colloquium, and we're happy to have here with us Priscyl Anctil Avoine, who is a postdoctoral fellow in feminist security studies at Lund University in Sweden. She's a researcher in feminist security studies, and she focuses on embodiment and emotions in post-war settings and also war settings. Recently she worked on the cases of Nepal and Colombia, which is she's going to present today here as well. And she looked at the political militancy of women ex-combatants during and in the aftermath of leftist armed struggles in this country. And then in addition to her academic work, she's also actively involved in activities of Contestations collective in Colombia and in Canada, which is committed to formulation of feminist and anti-racist projects. And maybe you will share some of that in the presentation as well. So she has 10 years of experience in research and in gender consultancy with NGOs, civil society organizations, universities, as well as feminist and women's collectives. Welcome, Priscyl, and I would also already share that after her presentation of around 30 minutes, we'll have a discussion by our very own Claske Dijkema, who is a senior researcher at swisspeace. She's a Marie Curie fellow, and she's carrying out research on urban peace building, she takes an approach of geographies of peace approach, and which says that she's studying initiatives in European cities and not only in the global south, which is quite unusual in peace studies that we are looking also at violence in the north. So we'll have first 30 minutes presentation and then 15 minutes discussion. And afterwards, you here in the audience and people in Zoom are welcome to ask questions to both of the speakers. And then in addition, I'll just mention for the students who are taking this colloquium as part of your credits, that you're also welcome then to fill in the student evaluation. This is our last session. And then also if you have additional inputs for us, for Dana and for me, you can also write more extensive feedback in email. We'll be happy to hear your feedback on that. And now, welcome, Priscyl.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the organizers. And I'm very happy to be sharing a little part of my work today with you. I will try to sort of like explain a little bit of the context while I'm presenting, but feel free to raise your hand if you have any question. And before I start, I would like to also thanks to the Farianas that have been participating in my research. If I can present you that today, it's because they have accepted to make a conversation with me. And also you will see during the presentation that most of the photos are from my fieldwork or from an illustrator from Colombia. So I invite you also to follow her work on Instagram. So the zozobra was a concept that was constantly brought up by the woman from the FARC that I will refer to as the Fariana for this presentation. It was sort of a concept that they were using to express their feeling about how was the transition from the armed group to the civilian society. So in March last year, I met Sonia, who was in the FARC for a very long time, but has not been part of the official peace process in 2016. And she was still expressing this feeling of zozobra more than 8 years after she disarmed, right? And she was expressing it by being like as a feeling that is latent and will be latent all your life. It will be normal. You have to learn to live with this feeling of zozobra, right? And she was actually saying that the only thing you control is like how to control these fears of being in between two worlds, right? So what does that mean? It means that after more than 8 years of being in the transition, she still feels in transition between one world and the other world, right? So my objective today would be to expose this contradictory feeling of going from an insurgency, an insurgent armed struggle, to the civilian society. So I'm interested in this sort of like here and there, what's happening in between those two worlds, right? Between war and peace, or between what you will see is the Marxist-Leninist struggle and the now feminist struggle of the woman from the FARC, right? So I'm interested in this like embodied liminality that the women are transiting, right? And I will explain later what is this liminality about. So I basically have like two sub-objectives with you today. It's try to explore these special temporal and embodied feeling of in-betweenness, of feeling in between two worlds. And then second, to sketch out the gendered contestation occurring in those liminal space between peace and war for the Farianas. So I'm going to try to make this change without any, yeah, we got it. So just to situate ourselves quickly, and then I will come back later to what is specifically a reincorporation zones. So when the peace agreement was signed with the FARC, 24 zones of reincorporation were decided. So the combatant will slowly go from the mountains to those kind of sites, cantonment sites, where they could reintegrate civilian society. My research was conducted in the northeast region of Colombia, which is at the border of Venezuela. You see here in the map, in Caño Indio and Filipinas, and also in different cities around this region. And as we will see during this presentation, it's a region that has been historically marked as a red zone. So it has been, and it still is pretty much an armed conflict. So this is why we're talking about a post-peace agreement and not really post-conflict setting, right? So, and also it's the border with Venezuela. So we have like a triple humanitarian crisis over there, and you have migration, you have the armed conflict, and especially the border dynamics with global capitalism unfolding also, right? So I'm still skeptical about the change here. So how the research was conducted, it's partly like two research that I'm presenting today that are overlapping. I started to work on that 10 years ago, but what I'm presenting you today, it's more like the result of my PhD dissertation and my postdoc research. So it was mainly 4 months field work in 2019, and I went back in 2022 to sort of like take the pulse of how it was going, sort of share the results of my thesis with the Farianas that I've been working with, and to see how it was feeling, like what peace was feeling at that moment, right? And I think one of my main interrogation was how they sort of continue their militancy in the post-peace agreement. So once they lay down the weapon, what's happening with their militancy? Are they transforming it? How are they changing? How are they changing this militancy? And then, you know, field work never happens as you plan. And what happened was that sort of the territorial dynamics and everything that was related to space and the feeling of anxiety came out from my both field work that I conducted. So it was also a feeling that I got myself when I was there in the reincorporation zone. So it was like sort of what they were sharing with me, but also what I was feeling when I was there with them, right? It's mainly like the result of my biographical interviews and ethnographic observation that I will present today. Globally, I've been more or less an interview with 30 women either ex-combatant or ex-militant that have been in the urban setting, and 4 women that have been working in the implementation of the peace agreement with the UN or other organization. In 2022, I tried to go back to both reincorporation zones, but I could do just one because the other one was under armed strike with the ELN. So it was impossible for the ex-combatant even to get out of their house because they were confined and they were locked down by a military military strike by the other groups, armed groups. So I could only do the follow-up with one of the reincorporation zone, but I'm always a bit in contact with all of them. Right. So who are the Farianas? So they are mainly were in different manners related to the Revolutionary Armed Force of Colombia. And they most of them were in the guerrilla, the one that I've participated in my research, and they were peasant for most of them. And they actually insist on that identity as very important for why they have joined the guerrilla. And the urban militants, sometimes they have been forced to join the guerrilla because they were threatened by the state. So because of their leftist engagement, they had to sort of hide from the state. So they had to go, the only place that was safe for them was the guerrilla. And some of the women that have been participated also in my research were active in, for example, student movements or clandestine Communist Party, right? So it depends, but most of the militancy was clandestine before 2016. So this is an important point because after the peace agreement, what happened is that everybody gets to know who is who, right? While before the militancy was organized by cells, like 5 or 6 people would know each other, but no more, right? And so it's a diverse, sort of the participants are really diverse, but I would say that one particular condition of the one that were joined the FARC while being in the rural areas was that most of them have joined before they were 18. And this, we can discuss a bit more about that later, but all of them said they were willing to enter the FARC, and that was their decision. So they consciously joined the struggle, right? So where are we now? The state of transition is not so good. I think, as you know, like the peace agreement signed in 2016 was acclaimed as one of the most progressive in terms of gender and LGBTQ questions. And so the inclusion of a lot of indicators to measure actually how gender is implemented in the peace agreement. But it has been extremely slow. So just to give you an idea, the general commitment is like completed 30%, and for the gender provisions, we're only 12% complete. So it's very lacking behind, but it's also because the structural transformation are not really appearing, like it's somehow like just some indicators, but on the ground, you cannot feel like the structural change that is happening. And in that sort of like transition setting, there is a lot of change for the woman ex-combatant because you can imagine this transition from before living in a village and then after going in a guerrilla struggle and then back to like civilian society, it implies a lot of changes. So it implies changes in terms of politics, in terms of embodiment, like the whole military discipline has so much impact on their bodies. And then after you have also the sort of deterritorialization because you're accustomed to be in a nomadic setting with the guerrilla. And then now you go back to sort of having your house, the private place to live in. And then, so it's changed a lot of dynamics, right? And this is what I would like to sort of reflect with you about like these transformation as liminal spaces, right? Like sort of feeling in this between in two worlds that are very difficult sometimes to sort of like reconcile together, right? So in this particular space of my research, I want to reflect on liminality as an empirical and theoretical lens to look at this transformation that women ex-guerrilla fighters will go through, right? Because most of them will talk about this transition as really uncertain. So that this feeling, you remember at the beginning when I was talking to you about the zozobra, since they would talk about the zozobra in two different ways, when they were being bombed during the armed conflict, and when they are trying to figure out what their future is about. So you can see that it's a feeling of anxiety that they don't know what's going on, right? And so in this moment of transition, they have to sort of think about what they want to do individually about their future, right? While everything was taught sort of collectively when they were in the armed struggle. And so this is very important because most of the reintegration programs, they will ask the ex-combatant to become civilian and citizen again, right? So it's sort of like you have to forget your past as a combatant to really be or become a citizen normatively for the state, for example, right? So it's this sort of rupture with your past, but if you've been kind of fighting for 30 years, it's very difficult for you to kind of forget what has happened, right? So this multiple and complex identity is what I theorize as a liminal space in this research. So just quickly, and then we can maybe discuss about that in the Q&A. Liminality refers to the Latin limen, which means threshold, and it's a sort of, in psychology, it's a process of going from one world to the other, crossing boundaries, right? So I found it really interesting to kind of qualify this transitional zone where it's a space of transition, but it's a space also of transition emotionally, of transition in your body, and it's also a political transition. So it's certain different sort of transition. So it's kind of like, we can imagine, it's like between two things, it's like the threshold that is in between, right? So most of the time when we were having this conversation with the woman from the FARC, they were like, know how to reorient this, because imagine a very disciplined and militarized setting, and then now you have to think about your own life project, your own household, and those kind of things. So I found that it was really interesting to see that it was a bit like the structure is dislocated. Now we don't have the military discipline anymore, but maybe it's also a space for creativity. Maybe it's also a space for a reorientation of their militancy in the peace building moment, right? And that brings me to La Frontera, Borderlines by Anzaldúa, which was used by a Colombian author, Joana Nieto Valdivieso, that she tries to bring this into, okay, maybe we can do a synthesis of those two worlds, right? Maybe we can think about what the armed struggle brings to the peace process, right? So it's kind of this embodied position of the woman from the FARC is a possibility to think about peace differently, right? So it's, instead of thinking about when they were in the armed group, it was war, and it was combat, and it was just bombing, and like we kind of see it just in the sort of a negative way. Maybe there's something that they've been experiencing in that particular setting that can help in building a more gender just Colombia, right? So why is that? Because also they have this kind of double identity of being victim and perpetrator of violence. So what does that mean? Because, you know, transitional justice is always thought like, okay, we have perpetrator of violence and we have victims and we need to find a way to reconcile in society. But what happens if we have in the same body both a victim and a perpetrator, right? So it poses a different question about what peace is about and what transition is about, right? So I want to present sort of like the empirical results about, okay, so it's a bit about the field work in 2019, but also when I got back in 2022, I was like, yeah, it's getting more complex, and and I think it's like following also the transition in their identities, and that is also interesting to see how they're thinking about not leaving this insurgent identity, but like taking it to another level and in a different sphere to try to make nonviolent politics in the civilian society. So I will present it in 3 different liminalities. So the first one is the geographical one, and it's about the 2 reincorporation zones I was talking to you about. And it's about being in between war and peace, right? So it's a very complex setting because for now in Colombia, we cannot say that we are in peace, and we cannot say that we are even in post-conflict because there is a lot of conflict going on, and there is still forced displacement and a lot of problem related to coca culture, and also the I think we have to ask very important question about the deployment of global capitalism also in some region like the one I'm presenting to you now. So if you remember the first map I showed you, it was in the northeast region of Colombia bordering Venezuela. So the reincorporation zone is in between Tibu and La Guavara, and it's a long road to get there. And it's also there's still the presence of dissidents from the FARC and other armed groups. And it's also one of the regions where the coca culture actually increased after the peace agreement. So while it was in some regions, there was other cultivation instead of coca culture, there we saw an increase of that. And so it was always a bit in between this presence, absence of the state and war and peace a bit all the time. So you have a high resistance of the people there, but at the same time you have a very high militarization. So the state is there just when it's militarization, right? It's never there for you know, structural inequalities and stuff. And so the reincorporation zone is called Negro Eliezer Gaitan, and by the end of February this year, there was only 54 ex-combatants out of 300 that were in this reincorporation zones, but we have still other people that came from the border of Venezuela. So it's kind of a little settlement now with sort of not just ex-combatant, but other people living there also. But it's still facing the problem of the lack of access to land. And there's also a lot of problematic because they're so isolated. So it's very difficult to think about productive projects, for example. And one of the women ex-combatants was telling me that when she's trying to do work on gender, she's being silenced by the armed groups because it's like you cannot work on this topic because it's a militarized zone and etc. So when she tries to make some action, she's actually silenced, right? So there is a lot of very difficult dynamic because of this kind of liminal space in between war and peace, because you have the presence of the UN mission, verification mission of peace and blah, blah, but then at the same time, you still have a heavy presence of armed actors. The other reincorporation zone was Filipinas and Arauca. So you can see maybe it's a bit pale, but it's kind of like south of Venezuela. And it's a region that has been, so the Filipinas is here. The region has been really marked by the absence of the state historically. And this has meant that the guerrilla has sort of like being in most of the governance system was dominated by the guerrilla. And you have also like a militarization of the border. And especially in the last 2 years, there was like, I think 5,000 people displaced because of armed violence between armed force in Venezuela and Colombia. So it's a very tense border where you have a lot of different problem, and especially one affecting women is the sexual exploitation at the border, right? So it has also been choose there because, you know, when the peace process was signed, the FARC chose some different region, the 24 reincorporation zones were usually region that were under their influence, right? So it was easier for them to kind of make the transition to civilian society. But still those regions were also facing a lot of insecurity. So that's what now makes it really complicated. And when I wanted to go back in 2022, it was very difficult because even the women for the FARC were locked down completely because the Liberation Army, the National Liberation Army was doing several armed strikes during the elections. So it's always very difficult because there's a lot of military checkpoint and etc. So it feels a lot of insecurity. So it's not really like if you ask them if they feel at peace, they're really not feeling that way, right? And so it's always very complicated. The second liminality that I wanted to talk to you about is the spatial temporal run, and it's about the reincorporations on themselves as liminal space, right? So initially, those spaces were supposed to be temporary places. So it was supposed to be very transitional zone where they will go from the armed struggle to the civilian society. And it has gotten much more complicated than that because they've started to, like, it was a lot of unplanned costs. Most of the 5 minutes, whoa. I'm going to try to do my best for 5 minutes. So what happened in those reincorporation zones is that they became slowly permanent zones, right? So now they're like a small settlement, but it was all the guerrilla fighters that had to kind of construct a bit everything related to how they want to live and etc. But it was never clear if they would be able to stay on that land or not, because there is a big problem of formalization of land in Colombia. And so it has ended up as poor infrastructure. And then this has been a very difficult point because their idea was to do a collective reincorporation. But now what's happening is that they're dispersed in all the territory of Colombia because they have to find other opportunity to work, right? And then the precarity is very high. So when we talked about how they felt in the reincorporation zone, the main emotion was the zozobra, the one that I was talking to you about at the beginning. So it's this feeling of like being in a indefinite transition. It's being waiting for something, but you don't even know what you're waiting for, right? And I think a lot of them were talking about like sort of like finding a way to peace or a way to happiness, and it was sort of never coming. So there was this expectation for a better future. And I think this quote by Joana Rios, which she used in ex-guerrilla from Caño Indio, is really interesting. She said, I don't have my own house. I have to buy a house that is mine, even if it means drinking boiled water, but no, nothing. One has nothing. It looks like one just came to the world. One is here, and that is the same, like coming to the world for the first time. We don't have anything. We are living in the same shacks that the government gave us. They promised us houses, and they haven't even given us a brick to start building them. So the feeling of Joanna is also like, and you can see she insists it's like being born again. It's sort of like you feel you start all over your life again, and you also have to do that in a setting where you don't have, most of the time they cannot go back where their family are because of security reason. So you lose the family from the FARC, and you also lose what it means to be in a collective, right? And this is linked to a sort of feeling of being always struggling and struggling. And it's related to the feeling of being between war and peace. And then Nelly, she's from Filipinas, and she would say it's a very difficult peace to have. And one makes a sacrifice to have this inner peace. So she relates that to inner peace. But sometimes one also explodes with anger, hatred, and resentment. Is life difficult in this new phase that I'm living? It's very hard to face it, but you have to face it anyway. You have to get through it. You have to face this life and go through it with all the 1,000 difficulties. It's fighting and fighting and trying to move forward. And in the end, you resign yourself to it, just staying here and waiting for time to pass and surviving. And that's what you're dedicated to, struggling and struggling just to survive. That's what you dedicate yourself in the end. It's so much that the body does not give anymore. So you can see that she relates that to time, space, embodiment, and what she wants to narrate is like, it's sort of this emotion that she has to fulfill something in the peace agreement, but she don't know exactly why and she's struggling to figure out how she can move on. And that's why she said her body cannot take it anymore, because and Nelly is really activist. She's involved in everything related to the peace agreement, and she's, a very strong activist, but she still feels that she lacks something that was really clear for her in the guerrilla struggle. They are very clear, tell us, we go do the revolution. That's the political goal of what we're doing. But she still feels that now she's seeking change for this Colombia in a different way, but she still feels she's more or less trying to survive, and she's waiting for something to happen, right? And it's related to a lot of other testimonies of women ex-guerrilla from other countries and other groups, that they feel that they're just like thrown into something that they were not expected, like starting all over again, like a blank sheet, right? And it's also, I think, related to new dynamics that we're seeing in the post-peace agreement now. And anxiety is really the feeling of zozobra is really related to the territory and the land, right? And this quote is from Camilla, and she said, the situation is just people adrift. We're sitting waiting. It's a feeling of rage and desolation, because she was not even in a reincorporation zone. So there is this new settlement that appear after the peace agreement and after the reincorporation zone were not working. So they're kind of like small settlement in between the reincorporation zones and the cities, but they have nothing. So they're basically trying to survive in those new settlement, and the government is not funding anything related to these new reincorporation zones. So they're feeling really lonely, right? And on top of that, most of them are feeling stigmatized by the Colombian society. Sometimes they would say that they are referred to as terrorists and etc., right? So there is a lot of dynamics there that do not help them to kind of sort of feeling in this peace building moment. I'm gonna finish with the embodied liminality. And then we can talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's an important one, because it's everything that is related to their identity, right? And how they change and how they want to stay insurgent in the post-peace agreement. They don't want to demobilize, as it's the case with other peace agreement, where they're trying to say, oh, you've been a combatant, just forget about that. You need to be a civilian now. So the Farianas were trying to kind of sort of using their experience of war to think about, for example, feminist militancy in the post-peace agreement. And I think it's all related to the fact that they don't want to lose this identity that they had, but it's very complicated because being insurgent is not so easy in the Colombian society, and being opposed to the government or being opposed to some of the state violence, right? And I think this quote is really explaining well, because she used the metaphor of the shell to express how she feels she's not realizing herself, right, in the post-peace agreement. She says, in this process of transition that we are going through, I feel that I still haven't come out of my shell properly. I mean, I feel nostalgic at times, not because of living the gun or for not being in the monte, which would be the jungle, more or less, but for losing that unity with the people that we have been with. So it's like sort of losing this sort of collective identity, right? This brings us to maybe the final ideas that I wanted to bring about how we can recover the compañera política, or the woman combatant identity, and how this can bring us to kind of unpack this relationship between being a victim and a perpetrator of violence, and how this identity of insurrecta, of insurgent woman, can be useful for the post-peace agreement setting, right? And I think this quote by Carmen is really interesting, because she says that she felt always that they wanted to change them, but that she knows for sure why she's been struggling and why she's been involved in the revolution, right? She says at the end that we can't deny what we were, so we fight for it, right? So the idea of not denying this political agency is a bit like what they're struggling to put forward in the new setting.
Thank you, Priscyl. It was nice to have all these images now, because I've been reading Priscyl's work and I've been hearing about it, but I never saw these images still with it. So I'm happy about that, because it also gives another, it makes us feel a bit closer to to the context that most of us, I think, are not familiar with, and so it's. We're trying to get familiar with it, and that's helpful, because it's a concept that I found extremely interesting to learn about, and also about your methods, but also the fact that you've been going back to this place. And I think in research, especially in conflict research, which is a situation which is all the time changing, and then going back gives you also a different or another more complex way of actually understanding a situation that is still fluctuating. And I'm very grateful also for your contribution for helping us think this beyond this peace-war binary, which I think, I mean, we have been accepting this in peace research for a very long time, that this binary doesn't exist, but actually to make it researchable is something else. And so what terms and with what concepts can we understand this not war, not peace situation, which I think this post, and for me it was helpful to have this term post peace agreement rather than post conflict, and I think we can use this maybe also in many other contexts where people describe the feeling of living in that context as this is neither peace nor war, and I think that the analytical tools that you give us for that, like the idea of liminality, but also the idea of peace as an embodied experience, as an emotional experience, it's helpful or it might be helpful. It's actually also a question to you. What do you think is helpful for you? To understand this neither war neither peace situation. I also found the concept of obra very interesting. Like you give us terms that we don't have, but that people locally find for describing their situation. And I was touched by this situation and this feeling of not being balanced and being always on the verge, on the limits. a groundless feeling, which is also that feeling of not being able to ground, which is a point I will come back later on. If you can't ground, it's difficult also to grow and to see a future, and this importance of grounding. What do you need for that in a post-conflict situation? If I'm using generalizing to post-conflict, you said it was no place of quietude, and I also thought, yeah, I thought, well, okay, what is the quietude actually that they're looking for? But also that you described, it's neither in the present nor in the future, which goes back to this idea of liminality. And so that brings me to this question of the future that we quickly started to talk about. Like, I tried to learn through Priscyl, how does her work help us to understand peace in a different way? Because just as this peace binary has been accepted, but we're still looking for helpful ways to describe it. It has been widely accepted that peace is more than the absence of war. But then what it is and with what terms we can describe it, I think there's still a lot to do, and we're still really in this process. And so some of the things that I learned from you is the fact, well, what I liked about your idea of insurgent peace, that the Farianas, the people that had been combatant, actually attach a lot of positive value of this insurgency. And before you said that peace should not be quiet, it should not be this quiet kind of pacified form, but peace should be insurgent, because the things that we fought for continue to be important. And if we agree, or it has been agreed for us that we no longer use weapons to do it, then how can we still continue to fight in another way? A question to you, whether I thought like that peace is also material. When the Fariana says, well, they've promised houses, but we still live in shacks. So that also means that for her, peace is living up to these material promises. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this material piece that they're actually looking for. You said they were peasants. So in what kind of way do they think of sustaining their lives? I mean, are they looking for land for agriculture? Or you were mentioning that land was important, but I'm still curious, really how that works out, but also in this liminal space that these reincorporation zones are, what are actually the material conditions? You said, okay, they still live collectively, they don't have nomadic lives anymore, but how is that in that transition between a nomadic collective life and a completely individualized nuclear family house life? How is the transition, or the reincorporation zone also? But also the question about that peace involves the future. And I think there were several of these comments that were about seeing the future, seeing the path towards it, the opposite of Zozobra, having a telos, which was the situation in the war, but finding a new a way, a direction. But also that question of, and I think, there are, of course, a lot of specificities for this situation, because this was an insurgency war. And you mentioned that, like, working with the paramilitaries was quite different. Also because they might have joined the armed struggle not for the same, or for them it was not an armed struggle, they might have joined for different reasons, but that a lot of the women that you work with, part of joining the army was full of a hope for change, and how, for me, it was a good reminder how picking up arms can mean the hope for change, and how that's transforms later on. So these are some of the things that I learned. I'm also looking at my watch to keep in my time and to leave enough time for discussion. maybe some of the additional questions are about you started to explain like the reintegration of civilian life. Earlier you said like, but actually what are we integrating them to? And maybe there's resistance of taking on like more traditional gendered roles within society, and you were questioning a bit, well, is this society that we want to reintegrate them to so ideal? I mean, it has so many structural problems, and also maybe you can tell a bit more about those gendered roles, but also the resistance against it. The second question is, or I would also be interested if you could continue to develop on that question of post-agreement militancy. What does that, in what way do women continue to be militant? Would they like to be militant? I mean, I think the classical way of thinking is that that they can participate in formal politics, but is that something that they do or interested in, or do they find other ways of being insurgent and being militant? You were mentioning like that also their positions changed from a Marxist-Leninist struggle to more feminist struggles. And yeah, are there any connections with formal politics? Yeah, maybe the last one. So what I also found interesting is that you draw on post-colonial literature in order to explain a post-conflict situation. Do you think that do you know other works in peace and conflict studies that make this connection or that use post-colonial theory? And if not, do you think that there's that it might be interesting to do that maybe more generally?
I have to finish with notes. Okay. Yeah, I think peace is definitely. I think the thing is, it's an ongoing process. So it's sort of what I found difficult with the research was like also because the peace agreement was signed in 2016, and I sort of tried to follow what was happening, and it's always changing. Each time I go back, there's something new there out of reflection about that, and they actually change. So some of them would say like, okay, so I told you this in 2017 and 19, and then now I think this, and then we've been discussing about that, and we would like to think about our feminism this way, but we disagree on that, and so it's sort of a militant construction. So this post-peace agreement militancy is also sort of fluid and in contestation, and it has especially became a bit difficult because you know, in the guerrilla there was a lot of norms, and the norms were really clear. So if there is gender-based violence, there is sanction. If there is this, there. So I mean, it's not that the guerrilla justice system was okay, or you know, it's just that it was clear how they would relate to their male comrades, for example. Now, when they go to the militancy without weapons, then they face the same Colombian justice system. And so they have both to deal with those things and to deal with patriarchal backlash in the political party. So the FARC transformed into a political party. And so their post-peace agreement militancy is complicated because they have to deal with those kind of different levels of patriarchies, but also they have to deal with the fact that they've been in armed struggle within the feminist movement. So there is like these kind of different levels of militancy that is really complicated to take this insurgent stance and continue to sort of reconcile the Marxist-Leninist struggle with the feminist principles and stuff like that. But they're in this questioning, and I think it's very interesting the liminality responds a little bit to that also. It's like, okay, what is the struggle about, and what is what can we propose? And in between those, continuing the struggle with our male comrades, but also, adjust to the feminist struggle, right? And it posed a question of like, to which society we are integrating former combatants. And what is the thing is like they were fighting against structural violence. And then, okay, the question of like using violence to fight violence and what does that mean is another question. But then it's sort of like, I think they feel that they're reintegrating to a society that they reintegrate a classist, racist, and sexist society. So how do we think reintegration program if we start from the basis that they have to accept the terms of what is it to be a citizen? And I think it goes back to your question about going from this guerrilla struggle to sort of more privatized house with a family that should be in this manner. And like even like I was telling you about like these embodied change, and they were like, yeah, at the beginning having the keys of the house or like sleeping on a mattress, you know, like those kind of things that are it's sort of like they have to mold into what is already there. So reintegration should be a moment, a window of opportunity to think about what society is and how we are reintegrating and not making structural change. And actually that's the biggest failure of the peace agreement. It's like you have a perfect text, everything is there, but we don't see the structural change in practice. So how is that happening, right? And it has to do a lot with gender roles and also structural racism, for example. Peace is also material. Yes. So at the root cause, one of the root causes of the armed conflict in Colombia is access to land, and it's still like very problematic. And as I told you, like in the region where I was doing my research, there's a lot of problem related to coca culture and the substitution of cultures. And I think a lot of them were feeling that they sort of were telling me that they had this feeling of guilt because they negotiated with the government so the peasants would have access to a different life and access to land and land formalization and stuff like that. And they feel that it's not happening, and they feel certain responsibility of that. So I think for most of them, it meant that they would go back to some sort of like precarious situation. So some of them were like, so why we fought for 30 years, right? So I think this is also part of like, what is the tell us? What is the idea? Why are we struggling for now? Like what, you know? For a lot of women, it has meant that they have to go from outside of the reincorporation zone to find other economic opportunity. It has meant for some of them that they will go back to traditional roles because they lose the collective. So since when they stay in the reincorporation zone, they still have sort of this collective thing, and they still can relate to one another. But when they're out of it, it's beginning to be complicated. And one of the things that was not talked about during the peace agreement is the urban reincorporation, right? So what happened when they get out of the reincorporation zones? And so the long-term reincorporation is still to be thought about. And also, I think the relationship to the land is very important because since most of them were peasant and some of them were feel really hostile when they're in the city. So they cannot relate to this new space of reincorporation. So and it's very difficult because, for example, the Caño Indio, the one that was upper north, it's like, yeah, they can stay there, but they're not sure because there is no paper about the land. It's not formalized. So it's always a bit of an uncertainty of like how this kind of materialize in the long run, right? And it's linked to their feeling of like, yeah, I need to be here because I cannot be somewhere else, because if I go somewhere else, then I can be a danger for my family. So it's always related to the territory, how they feel about this material piece. Some of them would say that they are also trying to find this sort of like quietude of after so many years of fighting also, and especially maybe some of the women that have been more than 30 years in the FARC, or was sometimes they were feeling of like, okay, what's the purpose now? And like sort of this groundless feeling, and it's like we recognize the war veterans from the regular army, but not from the guerrilla, right? Because they were not in the good side of the story. So but they still have the same embodied consequences of having fought a war for a long time. Yeah. I don't know, like it's just a question, but I try to.
Thank you, Priscyl.
Time's up. For those who are still here, I just wanted to draw our attention to the swisspeace working paper series. And if you're doing completely exciting master's projects, you can also consider publishing them in the working paper series. And I brought the last two that I can leave here, and the last one is on EU migration governance as protective conflict, and which is a bit what Alan was saying. Okay, I actually think a lot of these questions are very relevant for me in thinking about migration and border violence and the situation of waiting here. But so it's quite innovative to think of migration in terms of conflict of our colleague Andrea. And this is the work I did with a student, and which is actually posing a lot of these same questions for the context of Bosnia, which has been post-conflict for 30 years, in which we were questioning, okay, and what does peace? If this is also a situation of neither peace nor war, how do you describe this situation? And is it spatial? Are there places in the city where you can experience peace, and are there others that you more relate to conflict? So I don't know, if you're interested, you can take them. I brought a couple of copies, and I also have one for you if you want to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Claske. Thank you, Priscyl, for a great presentation.